distinguished guests, and dear colleagues. Participation revolution through government-led preparedness platforms, getting it right in situations of natural hazards. It's a very warm welcome to you all, and a warm welcome extends also to our live audience who may be online today. So at the very start, can I ask you all to use microphones when you're speaking, and that captures it very well on the live stream, even if you're asking questions afterwards. Thank you. My name is Marion Casey-Maslin, and I'm the Executive Director of the CDAC Network. For those of you who don't know the CDAC Network, we're a network of UN agencies, media development agencies, NGOs, specialized agencies, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, and gather together to try to do better communication and community engagement on the ground. You will see from those slides it's quite an array. There's about 7 UN, 7 media development. We go by numbers of 7 at the moment, but it's an open membership. If you're really interested in this area, we have quite a lot of work done over the last 10 years. So this session today has been organized around a panel, which we'll very shortly introduce. But before we introduce the panel, let me just give a quick backdrop to where we are in this discussion. Most of you know that it's extremely complex trying to address engagement with communities during times of conflict or violence in countries. And we don't often get it right, but we have some good examples. However, you would imagine that we would do much better in situations of natural hazards, where it's so predictable in many countries, and we have really good data on where those disasters are going to happen, and even in the parts of the country where they're going to happen. But yet we struggle with that in the sector. And I suppose one of the biggest areas across the responses, be it conflict, be it public health crisis, or be it natural hazards such as hurricanes, etc., we always lack on the accountability to affected population side, and it comes down often to failures with communication and community engagement. 10 years on for CDAC, when we started working first, our first collective response, we talk a lot about collective models in the sector. Our first collective response was in Haiti in 2010 in response to the earthquake. For that program, we were funded by OCHA and the World Health Organization. Since then, we've been testing different models in different areas. Some worked well, some not so well. There's now about 20 national and sub-national platforms in different countries. And I'll show you a slide shortly on where those are. But the majority of them were set up only after the disaster struck. And I suppose one of the recurrent messages we have is that unless you have it set up prior to a disaster, the effect and the impact is really minimal. The lack of a link with the national disaster management authorities and establishing those relationships well in advance was a key lesson, and also the lack with the ongoing work on disaster risk reduction and that link with preparedness. The systems are already in place, you have to build on them. So a lot of innovative approaches have been tested since then, and particularly in the last 5 years, for more intentional, systematic and response-wide communication. We have lots of good projects. We need good projects, but we need to go beyond that for the systems level. So in recent years, with funding from the Australian and the UK governments, and through the support of the National Disaster Management Authorities, and the related ministries of communication and information in Bangladesh, Fiji, the Philippines, Vanuatu and Indonesia, among others, we have tested a few more models, and we'll be talking more about that on the panel today. You will see a spattering of platforms. Again, most of them linked to response. Most of them don't have government engagement. Most of them have not been anchored in the national humanitarian architecture. So the outcomes of this session: we want greater awareness of the role of pre-positioned national preparedness and response platforms for CCE, leading to more effective response. And we want a model that can be adapted in disaster risk countries to support locally driven, innovative solutions that reinforce, not undermine, national and local leadership. We're now going into a video from Bangladesh, and I'm going to hand over after this video to my colleague on the panel, who is going to moderate this session for us. And Dylan Winder is the UK Councillor and Team Leader for Humanitarian, Protracted Crisis and Migration. And after this video, Dylan will actually lead the session for us. Just 3 minutes of a video from Bangladesh. Thank you.
Bangladesh is often by natural disasters, causing loss of lives, livelihoods, and taking a huge toll on economy of the country. Despite this, Bangladesh has earned a global reputation for its efforts in disaster risk reduction. When disasters hit, people need good information as well as food, water, shelter and medicine. Right information during the time of disaster can make a huge difference.
আমরা মাইকে প্রচার করব, সাইলেন্ট বাজাবো, এগুলো শুনলে আপনারা সাইক্লোন সেন্টারে চলে আসবেন আর নিয়মিত রেডিও শুনবেন।
Communication with communities helps create a better and more accountable response. Two-way communications will strengthen the unity among affected communities and the responders.
জনগণকে কাজের সাথে যদি ইনভলভ করা হতো, সংযোগ করা হতো, তাহলে ওদের জানমাল রক্ষা করার জন্য ওরাই সিদ্ধান্ত নিতে যে এভাবে করেন, এভাবে করেন।
খালি রিলিফ দিয়ে হবে না, আরো কিছু দরকার আছে।
Bangladesh has respective act, policy, frameworks and tools for efficient disaster risk reduction initiatives that can ensure effective communication with communities. But the effectiveness and efficiency of these tools require capacity building and accountable management support.
আমাদের সুযোগ সুবিধা কি দরকার কি নাই ওগুলো জানা লাগবে, রাস্তা দেখে দেওয়া লাগবে আমাদের।
যারা দুর্যোগ নিয়ে কাজ করে তাদেরকে আমার আবেদন যে এই প্রতিবন্ধী মাথায় রেখে তারা কাজ করে।
আমি চাই সরকারের উপধাপের লোক আমাদের কথাগুলো যেন শোনে।
দুর্যোগে মানুষের ঝুঁকি কমানো এবং এটার জন্য গভর্নমেন্টের অনেকগুলো ইনিশিয়েটিভ আছে, সরকারি বেসরকারি। এই পুরো প্রক্রিয়াটা স্ট্রাকচারাল একটা জায়গা দেওয়ার জন্য অনেক আলোচনার পরে সংযোগ একটা প্ল্যাটফর্ম তৈরি হলো, যেখানে গভর্নমেন্ট এবং নন গভর্নমেন্ট অর্গানাইজেশন একসাথে একটা প্ল্যাটফর্মে আছে।
আর্লি ওয়ার্নিংটা ডিসেমিনেশনের ক্ষেত্রে আমাদের প্রাপ্তি অনেক বা অ্যাচিভমেন্ট অনেক, আমাদের আরও এগিয়ে যেতে হবে। এটা যেন টু ওয়ে কমিউনিকেশন হয়, কমিউনিটি থেকে যেন আমরা ফিডব্যাক পাই, সেই ফিডব্যাকের ভিত্তিতে আমরা যেন আমাদের রেসপন্স প্ল্যান বা রিকভারি প্ল্যান করতে পারি। এই কাজের জন্য সংযোগ অনন্য একটা প্ল্যাটফর্ম।
To further strengthen our continued efforts, it's been realized that information and communication are critical at the time of crisis and can save lives and livelihoods and guide disaster-affected population to make informed choices.
Great, thanks, Marion, and welcome everyone. We've got a very distinguished and interesting panel today, and we can obviously refer back to the video during the process. I just wanted to start by saying that for the UK government, this is a really important priority. I've been involved with the CDAC over a number of years, and we're very supportive of the whole agenda that CDAC's promoting. I actually went out to Tacloban and Guyane during the Haiyan disaster and saw radio stations broadcasting through CDAC messages, and it was all very, very impressive. In fact, we had our public scrutiny body in the UK did a review of our overall response to Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, and they said that the best value for money was actually the work that we'd done around sort of AAP and communication. So that's brilliant. Also, of course, we had the World Humanitarian Summit, the Grand Bargain, so we've got lots of commitments, and we really believe that part of our overall reform agenda for the system. So it links very much to discussions around joint needs assessment, around cash, but really around accountability and ensuring that people who are affected by crises can hold us to account for what we provide to them and that we provide what they need. So I won't go into too much detail. Of course, this year we've got other areas where this will be very important. So we have the UK is hosting the COP at the end of the year, and we will be looking at obviously participation, accountability as part of that process. DFID in particular is focusing on the resilience and adaptation element of that. Anyway, you didn't come here to listen to me, so I'm going to introduce our panellists. We have Ambassador Khan, who's the permanent representative of the Republic of Fiji here in Geneva. We have Ambassador Mansfield, who's the permanent representative of Australia here in Geneva. And also we have Jonah Anzalone, who's the head of disaster and crisis for the Americas from IFRC. So a great panel. We'll each give a short presentation, and then we'll follow maybe by a bit of panel discussion and also then Q&A. So please do think about exciting and important questions for the panel. Anyway, I shall hand over first to Ambassador Khan. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, and Bula vinaka, as we say in Fiji. It's a pleasure to be here. Fiji and, of course, other Pacific Island countries have experienced a greater number of disasters and also a higher intensity of the consequences of those disasters. And as a result, we see very little difference between our development journey and the need to respond effectively to disasters. And one of the turning points in the development of our policy, our humanitarian policy and our disaster risk policy in Fiji in relation to responses and resilience was the World Humanitarian Summit, which really persuaded us that we needed to relook at our disaster response policies to ensure that there was a fusion between development and humanitarian response. Humanitarian response is no longer a knee-jerk response whenever a disaster happens. The building of resilience then is key. And in the building of resilience, it is impossible really to approach this process without involving the community and having people in the center of this journey. So as a result of the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in 2016, Fiji made a commitment that it would transform its disaster response policies, and it developed a national humanitarian summit, which was grouped around a cluster coordination system, and really a summary of that is on the screen. But the part of the cluster system, or the cluster which is particularly relevant to this panel discussion, is the cluster on communication. We accept the fact that the way that we communicate with communities had to change, and that this is not a top-down communication system. It has to be a two-way. On the one hand, governments have to speak to people to warn them in advance of what is about to happen, but also to have a process which is not just part of policy, but also part of a legal framework of listening to communities and people. And so our cluster system in relation to communications, which is of course the focus of this panel discussion, is part of Fiji's national humanitarian policy for disaster risk management and is part of our legal framework, and requires this very close relationship between communities and partnerships with government. Having said all of that, you can't do any of this without political will. And it was political will that really drove the process of ensuring that the way that we communicated with communities, that we removed any kind of paternalism in this relationship and accepted the fact that governments could learn as much from communities as communities could learn from government. So an equal partnership, an acceptance that we learn from each other, and really importantly, to have a representative group of community-based organizations representing particularly those who might be most vulnerable in a disaster. So the cluster system then, and specifically the cluster on communications, can be broken down into two. And one is the working group on communication and community engagement, and the other on emergency telecommunications working group. And the lead for the emergency telecommunications group is the Department of Communications, with the co-lead of the Telecommunications Authority of Fiji. That really ensures that people hear as quickly as possible about a disaster which is about to happen, and also is part of the planning process. And this is really where resilience is key, that the part of the planning process, even before we think the disaster is about to happen, is in fact a discussion and communication with those that head the communications industry in Fiji. Also, in relation to CCE, is that the lead is the Department of Information. So again, as I said, political will so important, partnerships with government so important, but the co-lead is the Fiji Council of Social Services, which is really an umbrella group for all NGOs in Fiji, as well as UNICEF. And I really like the fact that UNICEF is one of the co-leads, because it accepts the fact that children are really one of the most vulnerable when it comes to disasters. So then how do we approach partnerships with the community? And I have to say that the way we have learned in Fiji is that this is a transformative process for us. We have learned as a country that the way that we communicate with community groups, with people, had to change, and that communities had to change. That we had to ensure that we really were talking to people and not, for instance, only to traditional leaders. And so this whole business about talking to communities has had a transformative effect on Fiji as a nation, because we're talking now about communications at a very substantive level, hearing feedback from the community, both negative and positive, about how we coped with the last cyclone, for instance. And our experiences in Tropical Cyclone Winston taught us a lot about what we were doing wrong. There are many, many countries in the world which have congratulated us on the way Fiji responded to the most serious cyclone which ever hit Fiji. And we're very proud of those congratulatory messages, but we also accept the fact that this is a work in progress, that we made mistakes, as a result of which we have strengthened the cluster coordination system. So on the screen, you will see, and I won't go into it in detail because I know that this is we have limited time for this first part, but on the screen is what we have done to work more closely with community partnerships, and how we have had a self-monitoring process of reviewing how we're doing, particularly with the Fiji Communications Cluster in relation to CCE, and how we have worked with our experiences to really build a stronger cluster process. And we have really put at the center of this journey training needs, and we're hoping also to work very closely with Vanuatu and CDAC on training early this year on improving communications. So the next steps for us is to update the Fiji Media Telecommunications Landscape Guide, which gives us not only prior warning, but helps us to work better with media organizations in a more constructive way. There is, for instance, a radio called FemLink, which specializes in talking to women, particularly in the rural areas. So this is an area that has been neglected in the past. How do you talk to rural women and cut past old community barriers to really ensure we're hearing the voices of women? So this is a media unit which has been extremely valuable in ensuring that messages go out to women. Also to expand the participation in the CCE working group, to have more inclusiveness, to ensure that more NGOs, for instance, are represented, to set scenarios for potential disasters and really work on being prepared. And finally, this joint Vanuatu-Fiji learning event in early 2020. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ambassador Khan, and thank you for highlighting some of the really critical issues. And obviously, your government is a leader globally in these. But I thought, the political will, the fact that you've linked your policy and your legislation to this. Interesting comments around humanitarian development. I think that's something we're all looking at. So great examples of how you're working on that, but also this sort of co-leading with the NGO community. But I'm sure you'll have some questions around those issues. So over to Ambassador Mansfield. And Ambassador, Australia's signed up to the Grand Bargain and the Sendai Framework commitments. Be interesting to know what steps you're taking to look at systematic two-way communication and engagement with communities as part of localisation and participation agenda. And I know Australia is a great supporter of localisation agenda. So over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Dylan, and thanks for having me on the panel. This is one of those topics that comes up time and again, and I think it's really interesting that further on we get into that question about communications and how can new communications affect this, because it does feel like quite a fast-moving area. But you're absolutely right. For Australia and for our contribution to the region in terms of supporting disaster preparedness, these are the sorts of issues that we're looking at very closely. And the engagement that we have with Pacific nations is really critical, and that sort of sense of those long-term relationships, I think, is a key part of that. So from an Australian perspective, we've made those commitments to under sort of Sendai and the Grand Bargain, because it's quite clear that to be really effective in the eye of the disaster, you really do have to have had that preparation, and you do have to have had that that early engagement across all levels. So it's really, the driver is about effectiveness at the end of the day. So it's very, it's become, I think, increasingly, really true and really bedded down that the more local the response can be, the more effective it's likely to be, and the more it's likely to capture the most needy, the most vulnerable. And so as a donor, what Australia is trying to do is really support that capability in our partner countries. So helping to strengthen communications and engagement with crisis-affected communities is critical, and we see quite clearly too the adverse effects if we don't get it right in terms of numbers, the quality of the recovery afterwards, and the sort of long-term effect, which, as the film from Bangladesh showed, is potentially quite deep in terms of the economic recovery long-term. So there are really good business reasons for getting that right, as well as the ones that compel and impel us to have a humanitarian response. So as a donor, we try to use our influence in a number of different ways. One is to advocate for and champion participation in policy engagements, and ensure that we really are getting information locally, but also in fora such as this, and drawing on the sorts of excellent examples that we've had from Ambassador Khan. We need to invest too in new thinking, in analysis on how we improve the quality and the accountability more generally in the humanitarian system. So our partnership with the Centre for Global Development and the CHS Alliance are two examples of how we can help promote independent approaches to communication and to that community engagement. Another thing that we've tried to be very active in from an Australian perspective is investing in DRR and disaster management programs and the architecture, and in particular those ones that place localisation, that place participation and accountability right up front and centre, so we can look for ways to incentivise delivery partners that do have the most sort of effect in terms of empowering local people and organisations. So, I think we're already getting very positive feedback and better responses, and that issue about data and understanding the impact and what's been important is critical. So your comment earlier about the DFID analysis was really interesting, where your UK support had the most effect. So we are certainly looking at ways that we can, get that preparedness phase right, such that good practice in community engagement really is embedded in the disaster response. For us, it's really been very much too about building relationships and networks, and they're absolutely critical supporting the localisation and the participation revolution agendas. Those are the sorts of things that you can't do, or you can only just do during the actual crisis. You do need to have done them beforehand. And I had the great privilege of going to Fiji as part of Australia's response during the aftermath of Cyclone Winston. And it was really interesting then seeing the connections between the Fiji military and the Australian military. They already knew one another. They understood how to operate. And of course, this particular crisis was the one that had to be responded to. But having those links in the military and the civilian areas was absolutely critical to a quick and an effective and really well-connected response. So for us as Australia, working with the NDMOs, working with the stakeholders, international, national and local, and again the emphasis particularly on the Pacific, is really critical to the way we try to support the reduction in terms of disaster risk and preparing the responses. And I'd add into that our partnership with CDAC and Ground Truth Solutions, particularly in terms of establishing communication and community engagement platforms, both in Fiji and something we did in Vanuatu as well. And those platforms are embedded in national disaster management architecture, and what that means is that they can promote actions for really strong community engagement, and that is collecting and acting on community feedback during a response and continuing preparedness work after the disaster. I'll just point out one other particular program that Australia's been very engaged in, and that's called Disaster Ready, and it's our largest ever investment in disaster preparedness and resilience in the Pacific. And that is about supporting Australian NGOs who can work with disaster management partners at the national, subnational and local levels across the Pacific. Disaster Ready supports NDMOs and other partners strengthening communication and community engagement. And by doing that, it helps to build the capacity of local organisations to engage really genuinely and effectively in local and national disaster management architecture. Disaster Ready also has a particular focus on voices that need amplification in disaster response, and exactly as Ambassador Khan mentioned, going to those most needy, in particular women, children and people with disabilities. So I'll just stop there on that one, and I'm happy later on to sort of go further into those. Thanks, Dylan.
Great, thanks, Ambassador. And I think really important that you pointed out this whole sort of issue around long-term partnerships and preparedness, and I think we've all experienced that. And I guess it's similar in your region. That's a really important envelopment in a part of how you do this. I thought also the piece around data and learning is, again, it's common across both of your activities, and how we can do a bit more of that, maybe looking at the CDAC network and also Ground Truth, who I think we also funded in Nepal to do a platform in terms of accountability to affected populations, and that demonstrated how you can do this in a sort of live type situation. But very appropriately, we're going to move on to IFRC, and of course IFRC are the embodiment of localization through your national societies. And we're also actually, I should have said, we're funding or contributing to a new global partnership which is based in IFRC, the REAP initiative, which is about linking humanitarian development and climate, looking at forecast-based actions, and I hope that it will be also looking at some of the issues we're talking about today. But I mean, you've signed up to movement-wide commitments for community engagement and accountability last year, I think. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit about those, but also about your broader work on localization revolution, the participatory revolution, and accountability to affected populations. So, John, over to you.
Thank you, Dylan. It is. I mean, last year's resolution, it's been less than 2 months, but localization for us has really started over 100 years ago. Less than 2 hours from here in the Battle of Solferino, where the entire Red Cross, Red Crescent movement really started, was as a result of a Swiss businessman going to the Battle of Solferino and seeing this kind of suffering and this idea of what can communities do purely through volunteerism to really enable the humanitarian spirit. And you fast forward to today, where we just celebrated 100 years as a secretariat, and it's really a powerful manifestation. I think the words systemization were used, and I think that's really what the general resolution really does allow us to do, is systematize across 192 Red Cross or Red Crescent national societies, of which my region is 35 of those, in a way that goes deeper. It systemizes the connection points to national disaster management authorities, departments of health. We have amazing examples of where community engagement and accountability that really stem from the most local level were manifested during the Zika response in the Americas. We had Red Cross national societies working alongside Carnival organizations, basically trying to bring communities into the Zika response at the most local level in a very different way than we traditionally would do with storytelling or working with national media authorities. So I think that's really what the General Assembly resolution really means for us, is really trying to take it one step further. Ambassador Khan and Ambassador Mansfield also mentioned this connection with international disaster law. We just celebrated the 11th year of the publication of the International Disaster Law Framework, which really, again, has a large component of bringing in the systemization of Red Cross, Red Crescent, and other humanitarian actors into the way in which we're talking about community engagement at the most local level. Because certainly it has to be at both levels. It has to be from the top and from the bottom and everything in between. There's no one silver bullet solution that we were to look at. But also I'd reflect and say that for us, community engagement and accountability, we have a lot to learn from the private sector. And really the role of the private sector, I took a sabbatical from my Red Cross and Red Crescent years. I've been a volunteer and now a paid staff member since 1994. And I went and worked for Airbnb, which was a very new experience. I'd never stepped outside of the humanitarian space. And when we talk about community engagement and accountability, the entire platform and business model, over $1.5 billion revenue every year, is based off of solely a community of engagement and accountability, the entire platform. Other platforms like Uber, or crowdsourced marketplaces, I think we have a lot to learn from user design experts, whether it be within academia or other sectors of the private sector that can bring in some of those best practices that are based in concrete methodology, not just marketing, and really, hopefully, allow us as humanitarian actors to really take the tools, communications tools, platform tools, and really amplify what we're doing both in response, in recovery, and most importantly, as was amplified, in disaster risk reduction. I've had the privilege of being in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh a number of times. I've never seen such a robust program. It's absolutely phenomenal. And really trying to bring in those tools from the private sector, from our partners within the Bangladesh Red Crescent and government authorities, to really figure out what's next over the next 10, 15 years. And I'll end there because I know we have plenty of time for questions with a short video from some of our work in Indonesia that kind of tells the story a bit more succinctly than I.
Earthquake of 7.4 magnitude struck central Sulawesi, Indonesia on Friday, 28 September 2018, followed by a tsunami that struck Palu city on the same day. Not only earthquake and tsunami, a liquefaction sank thousands of houses in the village. The combined effect caused the deaths of an estimate 4,000 people and many more missing, making it the deadliest earthquake globally in 2018. Indonesian Red Cross or PMI responded to the disaster response by mobilizing volunteers both from Palu and neighboring province to provide assistance such as evacuation, assessment, relief, water distribution, first aid and health service, temporary shelters, psychosocial support and restoring family links. Not only in Palu, assistance also had been given to other 3 districts in central Sulawesi. Community engagement and accountability or CEA was key in the response. Within the Palu operation, about 250 volunteers were trained and oriented on CEA. A weekly radio show was established covering topics relevant to the response. A feedback mechanism was established that I will talk more about it in a moment. CEA works closely with cross sectors such as relief to provide a help desk and important information related to the 8 items, also together with CAS team to develop the beneficiary communication and IC materials. PMI collaborated with the government throughout the response, and CEA was no exception to that. One example for this in terms of CEA was the feedback mechanism established by PMI. The mechanism collects feedback through different channels, such as a call-in radio show, face-to-face at relief distributions, and through a hotline. The feedback is then answered and analyzed through a system set up by PMI and IFRC. To formalize the feedback system, PMI and IFRC team piloted and implemented the IFRC Feedback Starter Kit. The collected data is cleaned of sensitive details and then pooled with feedback data from other humanitarian organizations and data collected by local government from Provincial Bureau of Public Relations Office. The data is then visualized in a common dashboard. This allows the humanitarian response and the government to have a more holistic view of community questions, concerns, and other feedback. PMI continuously communicates non-sensitive data to the government and also cross-checks it with the community. Additionally, the CEA field team refer relevant feedback to the government for follow-up. Other collaboration with the government is to provide a vital information in PMI weekly radio show program to share specifically about health, disaster risk reduction, WASH, shelter, or any relevant topics. It facilitates the discussion between community by call in to studio and share their concern. So today, led by the Community Engagement Community of Practice or CECOP National, PMI and IFRC are involved on the development plan of Information Hub for Emergency Situation. The plan is included to empower government to have an information hub as an integrated two-way communication between community and government. In this opportunity, I would like to thank to all my colleagues from PMI and also the IFRC who still works in Central Sulawesi conducting the CA activities. Thank you very much.
Example of where communications has played a role in an emergency response, and I was interested again with the continued use of radio and broadcasting and the importance of that. But I wanted to ask maybe the panelists a question around new technology, and maybe it's more particularly for IFRC. But we've seen a massive rise in social media and WhatsApp and people I know when they have evacuated from an emergency, one of the first things they want now is Wi-Fi connections. I mean, what can you say about the use of technology, and what do agencies like IFRC have to, what role do you play in that in terms of coordinating? And also maybe just in terms of a government perspective, it'd be interesting to know from Fiji whether or not you've harnessed some of the kind of new social media within your disaster platforms and preparedness. But maybe IFRC first.
Yeah, I think our key takeaway is that there's no one solution. It seems pretty obvious, but it's really tempting with new technologies, new providers. We're constantly solicited to hear the next new thing around technology, and I'm just convinced that there's never going to be one singular solution. So having a pluralistic approach, and most importantly, asking the community. So we had a really concrete example in Peru with the migration movement, where there were assumptions made around the use of Facebook or WhatsApp that really were grounded within a very short amount of time, weeks, by the Peruvian Red Cross, because they were able to first do what they've always done, which is stop and listen to the community first before employing a massive media campaign on one of the media circuits. So I think we just have to be open to the pluralistic solution. As tough as it is to wrangle it all in, it's not a centralized approach. And I will say some of the most basic technologies that we still see effective. I recall in the capital of Bangladesh, a radio room that is still very effective in getting radio communications to remote areas of Bangladesh. So we can't discount technologies that may have been very relevant, more relevant 25 years ago. They still may be very relevant to the most remote last mile communities. And we can't just simply disregard those. That's the kind of conclusion that we've taken away, is that the pluralistic approach has to be used.
Thanks. So pluralistic approaches. I just wonder, is that similar in your responses?
Well, it is, because although the National Disaster Management Office really does use social media in a most effective way in communicating with people, in being open to feedback from the community through Facebook, through Twitter, and so on, you still have to have open the option of telephone, of email, and also of communications which use traditional forms of communication through community leaders because of the digital divide. Not everybody in the maritime parts of Fiji are going to have access to Facebook and Twitter, and so you do have to have this pluralistic approach. But there's no doubt about it at all. Social media is a most valuable tool in responding and building resilience.
Great, thanks. And maybe Ambassador Mansfield, I mean, you're a large donor working on localization. I'd be interested to know whether, how you're looking at new technology within that. But of course, Australia itself has just suffered from terrible fires. So, I don't know whether you're connected into what's going on within your own country in terms of the use of social media, but be interested to get your views. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan. No, I think these are really interesting questions and absolutely interesting for Australia. But that question of localised, how local are the community messages is really important too, because, a country as vast as Australia, or one, might not have the landmass, but still has, hugely different weather conditions from one part to another, such as Fiji. There's no point necessarily having a national message. It needs to be local, and I think that's really important, and that's part of all of the sort of work that we're doing. And going back to this point about radio remains important in Australia. There's a sense that the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, has a responsibility as a national broadcaster to get emergency messaging out. But again, it's capable of doing that at a very local level. I'd say also there's a question in terms of social media and how governments wrestle with this, and that's about credibility of information and quantity of information, because I think there's an extraordinary amount of information that can go in both ways now. And it's a question I kind of wonder myself in terms of social media. How do governments manage the amount of information that might actually be coming out, and indeed how do communities? So fabulous tools, and they can absolutely go to the heart of this question about being very, very local and very, very specific. But I imagine they're also posing other problems for all of us, in fact. Thanks, Dylan.
Thanks. Maybe I think that's a really important point in terms of how you deal with this massive information. I mean, does IFRC have well, you talk about pluralistic approach, but how do you manage that? I mean, is that something that you have a strategy on with your national societies? Do you provide training? We saw a little bit there in terms of training, but maybe if you could just kind of close the loop on this one. And then to a different question.
It's a challenge, and we're still in hyper learning mode. There's probably two pieces. I think one, we have an incredible support network remotely that can help synthesize very complex messaging into tangible points. I will say, though, the most common denominator to validate or debunk rumors is always going to be the most local branch or the most local actor. So for us, we have a group called SIMS, and it's this virtual information management group. And we can essentially push things up to SIMS, a complex problem. And it's not just simply making infographics, but really to help disseminate some of the chatter. But the technology's there, and certainly what I will say from academia, there are amazing artificial intelligence and machine learning tools that we have yet to figure out, because we need more volunteers that bring that skill set to the Red Cross, Red Crescent network. And the amount of synthesis that large nation states are using to help kind of pull out the white noise or the chatter that may not be factual information, I think we're all still learning, including the private sector. But that SIMS group for me in my region is a go-to when we have something super complex. We need to synthesize it into something that we believe is credible, most importantly validated by the most local Red Cross or Red Crescent within our region. Because we want to make sure it's not somebody in some faraway place that doesn't necessarily have the context of the community.
Thanks, Jonah. And I can see a number of experts in the room, so it would be good to get some of your views on this issue about how to harness new technology, perhaps when we come to the Q&A. But I wanted to move on to something a little bit different. Both of you ambassadors, you talked about the importance of lesson learning, and I just wondered, what sort of trends are you seeing from, maybe particularly in Fiji, from the work that you've been doing with communities and the feedback? What are the lessons you've learned? How do you think that this has really improved the preparedness and response of the communities affected on the ground by disasters, but also their engagement in this whole process? And maybe Ambassador Mansfield, I don't know if you have a sort of broader experience, particularly with the Grand Bargain work, on how this has also helped change potentially donor behaviour, so that donors are also learning and moving on from this. But maybe we could start with you, Ambassador.
Thank you. As I said, the cluster process really has been invaluable, but it is work in progress. And we can continuously see the need to be more inclusive, to have groups involved in the clusters which have traditionally represented environmental issues or development issues or vulnerability issues and bring them all together on this one platform. The other really important issue is that we have continuous discussions about climate change in Fiji. And so there is a close synergy between our discussions on climate change and our discussions on disaster response. And currently we're having discussions on a climate change bill, on an act. And that's bringing these communities together. I think the important thing is if we're going to respond well to disasters, we really have to have as broad a spectrum as possible of those groups which are represented at community level to ensure that everyone's voices are heard. And also in the course of this journey, we are empowering groups in the community which then see that they're making a difference to this really important national journey that we are all on.
Great, thanks very much. Ambassador, you.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I'd say that the big lesson learned is probably one that reinforces the message that's coming out through here, which is trust and invest in local leadership, and that the more local, the more sort of authentic in a way the information is going to be. So to work to support those structures, and just by way of one example, and again, if I could point to the response to Cyclone Winston in Fiji. One of the things that Australia has a capability of doing is responding with medical personnel. And the typical way that has been rolled out for a long time is by sending out a kind of a mobile hospital. And so there's a lot of kit and there's fantastic people and they're able to be drawn from within the state medical system and deployed at quite short notice. But the message came through very clearly from Fiji on this occasion that that style of putting in a big field hospital was not what was required. What was the hospitals were managing, that was not the problem. What they needed was backup locally with the local clinics supporting nurses and GPs on the ground. And so instead of having, this one hospital set up, the medical personnel who came were then distributed around the communities to support where they had the need. So we're listening and we're learning all the time. And just that sense too that it has to be about this crisis, not about the last one. We learned something from the last one, but what is it that this one requires? So I think that's probably what we're trying to bed down. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Ambassador. And maybe I should also say, just from a UK DFID perspective, I mean, certainly we are trying to embed this issue in a lot of the work that we support. So, for example, there are indicators in our core funding to all the UN agencies and the Red Cross around accountability. And certainly we see multi-year financing as really important part of that in terms of developing these long-term partnerships and the sort of preparedness plans, early action plans that you need. Maybe I'll just come to perhaps the final question for the panel, then we'll open the floor for discussion. So the CDAC network believes pre-positioned national platforms for more systematic communications and community engagement have the ability to bridge the so-called humanitarian development divide. And I think a number of you mentioned this. So in your view, what do you think are the top ingredients necessary to maintaining functioning national preparedness platforms that will ensure disaster readiness from a community engagement and accountability perspective? So maybe, can I start with IFRC?
Yeah, briefly, ingredients, willingness, certainly the enabling environments at multiple levels, government, humanitarian actors, et cetera, communities, right? But Dylan, you hit on something really important, and it's the grand bargain element of multi-year funding. I affectionately call what we do in humanitarian work death by project. Everything we do is either a 6-month project in an emergency environment or 6-month funding or year-end funding. Can you spend this before March? And it's really difficult to actively engage communities in a meaningful, purposeful way without the hope that it's sustainable and, most importantly, thoughtful. And so that accompaniment is only possible through a transformation of how donors are looking at CEA in a meaningful way. We're now 4 years into the grand bargain, and we aren't seeing the types of commitments from multi-year funders that the grand bargain was hopeful to bring. So I think those two ingredients, I'd end there and say we're hopeful that that will really, certainly our negotiations with governments and with their Red Cross partners is to enable that environment to allow for more flexible funding.
Maybe I could pose the same question, Ambassador Khan, to you.
Yes, thank you very much. We do identify greater resourcing and funding as being key, but we are seeing actually a difference from our traditional partners in the Pacific, specifically from Australia and New Zealand, in the increase in humanitarian funding that's available, that is offered to Fiji, and we're also seeing it offered in a very, very focused way based on partnerships and the empowering of communities. We've seen this really, really quite obviously, specifically from Australia and New Zealand, and that's been a really positive trend in the past few years. We also acknowledge, I think, the importance of government commitment, partnership, leadership. Ultimately, as I've said earlier, without political will, this is not going to go anywhere. And lastly, I think a willingness to listen to communities and to people, to things that they will say which are both negative and positive. I mean, of course, no government wants to hear the bad stories because it's, ultimately, politically, it's not very easy to hear. But we have to be willing to hear stories from the community which do not reflect on how well we responded the last time. And so I think this willingness to listen is absolutely key.
Thank you, and maybe Ambassador Mansfield, it's the same question to you, and good to hear a shout out for Australian funding there from Fiji. So.
Thanks very much. Look, three key elements that we would point to. One comes back to the point about the grand bargain too. It's a long-term investment, and it's a long-term investment in the architecture and the partnerships long-term, and it's that trust in terms of things, being best done at the local level. So it's that kind of big picture. It's certainly also working across all levels and being responsive as a donor to where which level is going to be most effective, and how they're to support the national authorities to work with the local authorities on that. And as part of that, it's clearly also about building up the capacity of the local level actors. And then thirdly, it is partly that lessons learned question. It's the evidence base. What did you learn from last time? What worked? Exactly as Ambassador Khan said, asking yourselves the tricky questions and seeing what the data is. And that's a big investment too, because once you go through, as all of you know well, that's the sort of full-on crisis part and all of the adrenaline and all of the sort of responsiveness that goes with that, actually then working through what it meant and then how you can analyse and use that to better prepare and respond in future. So those are the three things I'd point to.
Great, thanks very much. So we'll move on now to Q&A or comments. So if any of you have comments on this agenda, please do also make them. I think you can probably also ask Marion to sort of slightly join the panel, because obviously CDAC has a key role in this. So let me open the floor. If you could say your name and your organisation, that'd be great. So questions.
Yes. May I start? This is Mohsin from Bangladesh. I am the Director General of Disaster Management Department in our country. So, with this word, the understanding risks from natural hazard is not only a knowledge problem; it is also a communication problem. You know about our country already. The IFRC representative mentioned it's a very tiny country, very little country, but the population is more than 170 million. In our country, and we are facing every day almost natural or the man-made hazards. And in our country, we are very happy that we have a very good political commitment from our government regarding to become a resilience nation. And our strength is the volunteerism. If you remember the video from our country, we have 4.7 million volunteers. Success, we have the urban volunteers, we have especially for the cyclone preparedness program, which established in 1972 after a very, very big cyclone, what happened in our country in 1970. At that time, the population was 7 crore, and then 1 million people died at that time. You'll be happy to know that nowadays, from 7 digit to it comes single digit. that especially the death casualty rate. Whatever I have seen that here, you mentioned that the community involvement is very important, what we are using now. Our total national motto is the disaster management as whole of the society approach, especially the community-based disaster management from top to bottom. And I want to mention here one thing that the national and the sub-national level, we have different triads. National, sub-level, even then the ward level, the village level, we have the committee. And we have the two types of committee. One is managerial, and there is the, the response team we have. That is the only key point in our country that what we are managing. In case of the man-made, such as if I mention the Rohingya issue, you see 1.1 million from 25th of August 2017, still now we have. And he rightly pointed out that how we are going to manage through all are the volunteers involved in our country with all this issue. So here is the last point from me that the communication is very important. We have 17 community radio. Though it's very small country, but we have local dialogue. So local dialogue, people doesn't understand the national level message from the radio or the television. So we need to increase the local level, information dissemination system, such as we have local radio communication system. And then whatever the Fiji ambassador mentioned, still we are using the what called the traditional system that volunteer goes home to home, house to house, to inform them. The last point from me, last May there was a cyclone Fani. I think you know that. Within 8 hours, it was possible for us to shift from their house to the shelters, 2.2 million people within 8 hours. And this is only due to this was only possible due to the volunteerism and volunteer system. So this is all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think we all know that Bangladesh is a leading example of preparedness, and you've changed a lot over the years in terms of how you respond, particularly to the flooding and other types of natural disasters. And it's really important that you've identified again this issue of the kind of local level needs for the communication and the use of radio. I don't think there was a question in there, but so let's move on maybe to others who either want to comment or question. So anyone else from the audience? There's one in back.
Hi, this is Maya from DCA, Dan Church Aid. I'm generally, in all the localization sessions that I've been in, lacking a bit of reflection on gender and inclusion of women and women-led organizations, local women actors. And I think, I would like to hear some reflections from you on how you're including women and a gender perspective in preparedness and building up resilience in communities. We know that women are often adversely affected, blah, blah, blah. All of that has been said, but really, how are they engaged in actually preparing and responding to the disasters?
Great, thanks very much. It's a really important question. I'm sure Ambassador Khan will have something to say on that, but I'd also like to maybe then follow on with Ambassador Mansfield, because of course Australia has really been central to looking at disability as well. So I think that's, we're talking about vulnerable groups here as well as just women, well, not just women, as well as women. So Ambassador Khan, would you like to?
Thank you very much. And, I've always said that responding to disasters is a terrible cloud on any country's development journey. But the silver lining in this cloud is its transformative nature in the way that countries are beginning to respond. And really, gender awareness and gender responsiveness has been that silver lining in many of our countries. So I would say one, key disaggregated data, which now I think almost every disaster response office in the Pacific is keeping, and extremely important for working out the impacts of disasters on women specifically, and also women with disabilities. And secondly, I would say there is a greater visibility on sexual and gender-based violence in disasters. So as I said earlier, we have radio stations which have been discussing this very issue to really warn women about the possibility see that in a disaster, because traditional lines of communication with police stations and justice systems and medical centers may be disrupted in a disaster, that women have to be particularly mindful of alternatives. And I think that this is one very clear link between effective communications and gender-based violence, and the need for women and girls to be specifically vigilant. So I think really in responding to disasters, certainly Fiji is very aware of the higher likelihood of sexual and gender-based violence and reproductive health issues as a result of disasters and the disruptions, and is guarding against them, and that is partly due to advocacy and partly due to the fact that we are keeping disaggregated data.
Thanks, Ambassador. I should also just point out that from the UK perspective, we really believe that this collecting robust data and information in a disaggregated way is really absolutely essential to delivering our own commitments on preventing sexual exploitation and abuse, and also sexual and gender-based violence. So it is an absolutely critical issue. But maybe Ambassador Mansfield, do you want to comment?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. And I'd say that gender and issues around people with disabilities is absolutely something, or two issues that are very much cross-cutting and cross-sectoral across all of our development agenda. So they are indeed themes, they're priorities that are totally embedded within the work that we do. And I guess I didn't sort of put more focus on them earlier because we were talking, I suppose, about the overarching architecture. But everything from ensuring safe spaces, and I think during discussions with UN and partner agencies who are supporting the Rohingya, for instance, became very evident very early on that they needed safe spaces, the importance of having toilet facilities that are separate, education for girls, the issues around sexual and reproductive health, that these are absolutely part of the Australian approach, and they certainly carry over into how we respond in the specific sort of disaster context. And the same is true very much of people with disabilities. And for example, there was a specific program we had in support of Tonga to provide cash payments to the elderly and the disabled. And this was money that was actually disbursed by the Tongan government, but indeed very important from our perspective that it was getting out through local systems, but to those who were most in need.
Thanks, Ambassador. Maybe I can turn to IFRC. And of course, you had your recent international conference, which had a whole resolution on women in humanitarian action. So,
yes, we reflect on it. It's a work in progress. Our first gender resolution was in 1978, and it really challenged, even back then, us to look within ourselves, our management structures, our disaster management staff, and composition. I'm fortunate. We have a humanitarian household. My husband works for Save the Children in protection, gender, and inclusion. And it's a topic that we often reflect upon. Within the Americas, for example, there's really this lack of focus around not only how the migratory journey of women is taking place, but also for vulnerable communities within the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, or in other inclusive categories. And it's not perfect, but I think the work within the systemization of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Network is really trying to challenge common cultural assumptions around how we lead ourselves internally. And really, I'm a firm believer that until we get that right, it's not going to cascade down to the most local level in terms of gender inclusion and diversity of volunteers. And there's an amazing initiative, thanks to the Spanish government within the Americas, for us to grow the number of surge deployable women leaders within both migration, natural disaster, and disaster risk reduction. And I really applaud them for giving us that little bit of space to figure out what that looks like, because we're proud of the number of female leaders we have, but it's not enough. And certainly that needs to transcend to the governance levels of Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies. Our new Secretary General held an all-staff on Tuesday, Jagan, an amazing human being from Nepal, and he challenged all of us to go back to our respective regions and to be mindful in how we're managing ourselves, because that will reflect what's happening at the most local level in the years to come.
Great. Thank you very much. So let's have some more questions. Any over the back there?
This is Amin from OCHA, Pakistan. I don't have a question, but I wanted to know to tell you, okay, this forum, okay, what we are doing in Pakistan on preparedness, what the government is doing. So I think it will be good for you to understand what's exactly going on or happening in Pakistan. I was part of in response in 2005 and in 2010. 2005 earthquake and 2010 flood in Pakistan. Hope you all are aware of that. It was a super flood and super earthquake, which almost 73,000 casualties in 2005 earthquake, and similarly, 5 to 10,000 casualties in 2010 flood. But at that time, when I recall, we don't have that capacity at that time. No disaster management offices, no response like that. Okay, very small capacity in the country available. But when I compare 2005 and now 2020, so we are now a bit we reach to the 50 to 60%, okay, we have the capacity to respond to such emergencies. We have a very strong National Disaster Management Authority office in Pakistan, lying in the country, that's at national level, and we have the provincial disaster management authorities at the provincial level. Very good coordination between all these authorities. What we are doing as OCHA and humanitarian actors in the country, we are improving or enhancing their capacity in different areas, in assessments, how to respond to different emergencies. If I tell you, for flooding or for monsoon, the government has a very good capacity now. They are starting preparedness or preparation in the peacetime, like in March, in April, May, and June, because we have the monsoon period from July, August, and September. They prepare all the districts, prepare their contingency plannings, share with the provincial authorities compile all, share with the national authorities, and they have a huge document on that, okay, if something happened wrong, so how we are ready for that, what will be our plan, how we move people from that area to the safer places, how much money required, in which area, what is the stockpiling, pre-positioning, something like that. So that is, I think we are good in that. But we are, as we all know, we don't have any prediction or, for earthquake and other disasters. As you all aware, Pakistan is there on 6 or 7 out of 10 countries prone to disasters. So currently we are facing the winter emergency. In some areas we receive very huge snowfall. Still the many areas are not accessible. And now the government declared locust emergency in the country. That will be a severe, very severe in the coming summer season. What we are doing in the country, if we receive any alert, so the government, the NDMA, and the provincial disaster management authorities immediately issued a text messages through mobile, through Pakistan Telecommunication Authority, and through Facebook and Twitter. So that's the messages in the specific area where the alert are issued. Other than that, we receive an NSERA classification for our team of Rescue 1122 for medium response. So our team is now ready to go anywhere in the world, okay, if that is required. A very specific and very trained team in the area, in one of our area in Lahore in Punjab province. Now why we are here, okay, I bring one of my colleagues from National Disaster Management Authority, he's sitting somewhere else, to seek support from NSERAG and from other donors, member state countries, okay, to train other teams in the country. Because Pakistan is very big, Pakistan is very prone to disasters, only one team will not be sufficient to respond to different emergencies. So now we are looking for another 2 or 3 teams in Islamabad and in some other parts of the area. But in the conclusion, like I said, preparedness, government is on board, the disaster management authorities are enhancing their capacities and they are seeking all the support what we can provide, and exactly when I was coming here to the chairman, NDMA, so we talked to him, okay, what kind of support they are required, and that's what we are seeking here, okay, and we are providing all that support to our National Disaster Management Authority. So that's, I think we are on the track, okay, and still lots of things need to be done, but at least we are on the track, okay, on regarding preparedness and support of the government, and they are enhancing their capacity to respond to any disaster in the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and great to see the voice from OCHA as well, because of course you have a really important role to play in terms of supporting governments. I'm going to pick on some people. I was going to pick on you, Nick, anyway, actually, and maybe Wendy behind you. You're obviously looking at this from a more global perspective, and I just wondered, we've heard some really good examples of particular national platforms and the political world. Are you getting a sense more globally that this is a sort of growing trend? I mean, how are governments listening to communities? Are we getting what we need? Are we able to shape responses according to that?
Thanks. Yeah, Nick Van Praag from Ground Truth Solutions. I think there is increasing interest in this kind of platform, which we're seeing in Fiji and Vanuatu, where, thanks to the Australian government and the authorities in those two countries, we're doing some interesting work with CDAC. And the local authorities and many members of civil society in those countries. I think there's a real sort of head of steam behind this idea of bringing together the kind of basic building blocks of a platform. And I think the real challenge now is to put in place the incentives to see that followed through. And my question was going to be, what are the kind of incentives that donors and indeed the International Federation through its societies can put in place to encourage this kind of development, because that's absolutely central. And I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that. But it's the other piece of the puzzle, as far as we see it, is the importance of coming up with sort of indicators that relate to the level of action on community engagement and the extent to which people's points of view are being taken into account. And I think there we're really beginning to see sort of advances in the way programs are monitored, taking centrally into account the way people see the quality of that response and the inclusiveness of that response. So I think we're moving in the right direction. We've got a very long way to go. But I think the emphasis on data we heard earlier, I think, is really, really important. And to be able to work out the extent to which these activities are bearing fruit through the eyes of the community is really central.
Thanks, Nick. And I will come back to your question, but I wondered, Wendy, from a sort of ODI perspective, or the sort of policy agenda, how do you see this?
Well, I'm focusing mainly, Dylan, on the Grand Bargain report, because ODI has been conducting the annual report over the last few years and will do so again this year. And I think from our perspective, we've been looking at the different work streams within the Grand Bargain, including the participation Revolution 1, Work Stream 6, and localization, and also others where donors have committed and other organizations have committed to ensuring that the voices of people are heard and their feedback is taken into account. One of the gaps that we've consistently seen, which I think is supported by the Ground Truth surveys that have been done, is that although there have been improvements in including people's voices and in two-way communication, we haven't seen much evidence in the self-reports or in other sources of evidence to indicate that that feedback is actually being taken into account in terms of making changes to programs. So yes, it's being collected, it's being considered, the views are being looked at, and there's a real willingness to do that. And we think that's sincere, but we don't see the evidence yet from what we've seen anyway, and maybe Nick can even comment further on this, of agencies being either wanting to, or I think it's more a case of being able to adjust programming. And they will often say that they don't have the flexibility within their programs because of donor policies.
So back to incentives. I don't know, maybe IFRC, do you want to, or Jono, would you like to
come
answer?
To Panama, we'll pilot something. It's very indicative. I'm a practical ops guy, started there, and my heart's still there. So when I think about the way that grant funding works or pledge funding works, if we get an appeal or a DREF, we're telling the donor what the outcome and activities are, right? And our fund development team always will remind us, yes, and if you want to change an outcome, you have to go back to the donor. And there's no donor that I've worked with in my experience, there's amazing generosity at this table included, that it's difficult to change an outcome. It's very difficult. We could talk about months. And when we think about the humanitarian imperative, an operator is going to ask the question, what can we do to balance the ability to negotiate a donor agreement with the humanitarian imperative, especially in the emergency phase? If it's DRR, long-term resilience work, I completely agree there's a bit more space. But that's where I truly, sincerely would love to sit down with either agency to figure out what could we do to develop a feedback mechanism that meets the donor intent, but also the humanitarian imperative. And I sincerely mean this. When we do our ops meetings every Wednesday, if we had a way to systematize that, there's not a single person on my team in the 35-country context that would go, this is a bad idea. But it's always this hamstringing exercise where if I go back to, I'll pick on my own government for a moment, I'd go back to USAID and say, I'd like to change an outcome because we're hearing clearly from the community that tarpaulins aren't needed. That could be a month, it could be 2 months, it could be 3 months, or it could be never. So I think really the practicality, I think we could find some balance of a pilot to really engage some ground truth surveys, come up with some indicators. I love that idea. I would love that to show up in our next appeal, is where we actually have some CEA indicators and what that could actually look like on the next operation in the Americas. So I truly, sincerely mean that. If there are anybody in this room that has those ideas on how to operationalize it, but I will be honest, the donor piece is tricky. It's very tricky, and more so when it is what we call a DREF, a short-term operation of 3 to 6 months. Because our donors that fund the DREF generously will say, it's a 3-month operation. And we all know that within 3 months, to truly accompany a community in a discernment process, we're fooling ourselves if we think that's possible. Unless there's some back-end process at the national society level with their different projects to make sure that that's there ahead of time.
Thanks. Good suggestions there. We should note those and take them forward. I mean, just from a DFID perspective, we of course do have this as an indicator, as I said before, in our core funding. It is a very important element of our emergency responses. We are funding these sort of things, but we can't do it, we ought to have something to fund. So I think actually it's really important that we are seeing the government leadership that's been demonstrated today, because without that, we are not able to necessarily support things. We can't, DFID civil servants don't run these programs themselves. So we need that sort of system out there. And I think that's why, the changes that we're seeing through the CDAC network, through IFRC, through governments like Fiji are really important and critical to enable us then to finance those things. But at the same time, we would also call for more donors to do multi-year unearmarked funding, which I think also will help that sort of benefit. But I wonder whether Ambassador Mansfield, as a donor, incentives.
Well, I think the incentive, in a sense, is the results, and that comes back in a way to understanding what it was that was the problem that you were faced with, how you tried to solve it, and whether or not that was effective, and that's irrespective of whether it was sort of communications or delivering wash facilities, whatever. So, it is important to try and track what was provided and whether or not it got to the right places in the right time, and some of that you can do live, and hopefully within most responses there's enough flexibility to sort of move stuff around where it should be. But absolutely, that sense of having long-term partnerships, long-term multi-year funding, so that those decisions again can be made locally is obviously going to be important. As to Wendy's question about how is the feedback acted on, I can't in all honesty answer that, but I should also say I have the two experts here, Catherine and Claire, and so I could handball to either of them if they want to say something a little bit more specific in terms of what the Australian government might have done that would answer those specific questions about incentives and how much the feedback is acted on. But my sense is it is very much an iterative process, and complicated by the fact, of course, that each disaster throws up different challenges in different places with different partnerships to the last one. So that maybe there isn't a perfect response to this one, but as long as we've got that feedback loop, we're as well placed as possible to answer.
Catherine, do you want to come in? I can see you.
Thanks, Dylan, and thanks, Ambassador. Just quickly, totally reiterate Dylan's point about flexible multi-year funding. We try and do more and more flexibility, particularly in our rapid response funding, because, as you say, the dynamic changes. We hear different things from communities, and we have a deeper understanding of need once we're on the ground. Then there's a couple of other levels. Obviously, the accountability of governments is, the ultimate accountability is with government. This one works better. And so the governments in our region are being held accountable by their populations, and they'll certainly hear it and hopefully respond if they're not meeting those needs. But as a donor, how we're incentivising it is in part in our partnerships with government, but actually how we've funded our Australian NGOs under the Ambassador mentioned the Disaster Ready program, is we actually have accountability clauses built into those funding agreements with the Australian NGOs. So we are testing them and holding them accountable for doing that community engagement and responding to feedback. And it's a multi-year program, preparedness, response, recovery. So it has that element where it can adapt over time. And then increasingly, in donor forums and in discussions like this, we're really trying to put accountability on the agenda and make sure that we're all focused on it. So there's a number of different ways.
Thanks, Catherine. Ambassador Khan, do you want to give a Fijian government perspective?
Thank you. Our National Disaster Management Office has a consistent and constant evaluation process, which is self-evaluation as well. But that process necessarily involves community leaders who are vociferous if they feel they've been left out, or if they feel that they haven't been consulted effectively, and also with women's groups and groups which represent LGBTI experiences. So I think that kind of evaluation process from a government point of view is really important, and we don't wait for the next cyclone to do that process. It's a continuous process. The second thing I wanted to say is one form of donor and government partnership that seems to be very effective in accountability and self-evaluation is the Australian Humanitarian Partnership Program, which is based on the funding of NGOs, which then work very closely with Fijian NGOs. But in that partnership, there is also a self-evaluation and monitoring process, which I think very useful for the donor country. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we've probably got time for maybe one or two more quick questions. So if there are any. At the front.
Hi, my name is Marga from IFRC. We are talking a lot about governments, but what about accountability to people that are on the move across borders? So is there any good learning or good practices that could be replicated? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any last questions to add to that? Okay. I think maybe in terms of people on the move, I wonder whether, Marion, you want to just comment on whether CDAC's looking at that kind of issue, because I guess most of our work at the moment is specific to country level, regional sort of crises from a humanitarian perspective. And I don't know if we have a UNHCR person in the room, but you can talk about that because, of course, and maybe IFRC, you could also respond to that. So, Marion, would you like to?
Yes, thank you.
And also anything else you'd like to kind of add as a kind of closing remark?
Yes, brilliant. And this issue is coming up a lot more at the moment. And I suppose we first came into contact with it at a really large scale level during the European crisis. And we have a lot of learning from that, from the refugees coming through Greece and into Germany and other countries. And I think there's a number of people I see in this room who have a lot of expertise on that and how to actually manage that with people moving. And I think that's been well documented. The current crisis, I know in Venezuela, there is a lot of discussion going on about that and the regional movement linked to it. And it's a really tricky one to deal with. But I think we have some lessons, but we're not very good at getting them out. It takes a lot of time and effort and dedicated attention to actually get that lesson learning out and a lot of analysis. And we're not doing enough of that, I think, in the sector. And that's something in this decade, we need to actually move forward. But that's a tricky area. I mean, we're good at the refugee issues sometimes. The migration, that movement issue is still not something we've cracked well. So I know some people in the audience, and I know Jono also has some more on that. I won't say any more thank yous at the moment, but maybe at the end I will add. Thank you.
Thank you. And I speak in the context of internal displacement because as a result of rising sea levels in Fiji, we've had to relocate communities from the coastal areas. And this is a journey in which our National Disaster Management Office is actually very, very much involved. So we see it as part of their mandate. We could not move communities from their ancestral land, because mostly these are indigenous communities, unless the communities agreed to move. I mean, this is a very deep spiritual bond with the resources and with the land and with the sea. So actually, this experience in Fiji of internally displacing our people with the consent of the communities taught us an awful lot about the need to work with communities, to empower them, and to hear voices which traditionally had not been heard in the past. And it's been a transformative journey for us. We now have relocation guidelines. I think we're one of the few countries in the world which actually knows that this is happening, is going to continue to happen, and we have to have a policy which is based not only on humanitarian guidelines but on human rights. And an agreed position where it is communities which make the decision to move and not the government. So a huge learning curve for us and very much part of the mandate of the National Disaster Management Office.
Thanks, Ambassador. And of course, we've got the high-level panel on internal displacement this year. So I think this is probably something we can also maybe bring into that a little bit. Jono, do you want to answer your IFRC colleague?
A brief reflection. Yes, in the Americas in particular, with not only the Venezuela population movement, well, I'm with a quick story. Last week, we were in the south of Panama, small community of 140 indigenous Panamanians, and they are now finding themselves hosting 1,200 migrants. And one would assume it's Venezuela, right? Out of the 100 or 1,200, 100 of those are Venezuelans. The rest of those come from Yemen, Haiti, Bangladesh, and other parts of the globe. The reason I emphasize that is the lessons learned from the Panamanian Red Cross, not from the Federation, and really hearing the community, working to build relationships with the host community, and really to stop and apply some of the best practices that we've learned from natural disaster are currently in place, not only with that example, but throughout the Americas where there are caravans and those with protected status under the mandate of UNHCR, that we're still quite a lot learning, I would say. But I think in particular, this is an area that we've paid particular attention to because the assumption can't be it's all Venezuela. I mean, certainly we hear from donors often that everything should be in Spanish and the assumptions around the Venezuela community. But when we look at the host origin of most people that are making the trip, there's a substantial percentage that are coming from other parts of the globe. It's a classic example.
Great, thanks so much. So we haven't resolved all the issues today, but I think I won't do a huge summary because it's been a very, very rich discussion. But it's clear that communication is still central to delivering effective humanitarian outcomes. And we really need to continue to do more to make sure that this is much more integrated across all of the work that we do. Donors, of course, have a responsibility to finance this and also to finance in ways which are supporting local communities and addressing their needs. I think there's a point for us in terms of kind of flexibility and how we move, but also particularly the kind of multi-year. It's great to see some really strong examples from governments of very strong political leadership that have delivered real results. And I think learning from those is going to be really important. And of course, we heard a lot about volunteers and the communities themselves and their role in this whole area. So lots to think about, lots to digest. New technology is something to also think through, and social media. But thank you very much for coming. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. I'd like you to give a round of applause for our panelists and also to Mariam. So. And thank you very much and have a good rest of HMPW.